My fiancé invited her ex to our engagement party as her +1. I was reviewing the seating chart when my sister Olivia pointed at a name that didn't belong. We'd been working on the engagement party details for weeks, coordinating with the country club venue, finalizing the guest list, arguing over whether to have an open bar or drink tickets. I knew every person we'd invited because Melissa and I had gone through each name together, dividing them into categories. My family, her family, our mutual friends, work colleagues who needed to be included for political reasons. The name Derek Landry sat under Melissa's +1 allocation, which made zero sense since she was obviously coming as my fiancé, not as someone who needed to bring a date. Olivia watched my face as I processed the information, her expression somewhere between concern and barely suppressed anger. She'd never particularly liked Melissa, though she'd been diplomatic enough not to say it directly until now. Derek Landry was Melissa's boyfriend from college, the guy she'd dated for 5 years before they broke up 6 months before we met. She'd told me the relationship ended because he wasn't ambitious enough, couldn't keep up with her career trajectory at the architecture firm. I'd seen exactly 2 photos of him before Melissa deleted them from her phone at my request. A tall guy with dark hair and the kind of casual confidence that comes from never doubting yourself. Melissa claimed they hadn't spoken in over a year. I called Melissa immediately, stepping away from the dining room table where Olivia and my mother were addressing invitations. She answered after 4 rings, sounding distracted and slightly annoyed that I was interrupting her site visit at the waterfront development project. I asked her directly why Derek's name was on our guest list, and she went completely silent for about 6 seconds before launching into an explanation that felt too smooth, too prepared. She said Derek had reached out 2 months ago after seeing our engagement announcement in the alumni magazine. They'd met for lunch to catch up as friends, and he'd expressed genuine happiness for her moving forward. She thought it would be healthy and mature to include him in our celebration, demonstrating that we were all adults capable of maintaining platonic friendships with former partners. The explanation sounded reasonable in that frustrating way, where you can't quite articulate what's wrong with it, but you know something is. I asked why she hadn't mentioned this lunch meeting, or the fact that she was adding him to our guest list. Melissa sighed in that particular way she did when she thought I was being unnecessarily difficult. She said she'd meant to tell me, but kept forgetting because the Harborview project was consuming all her mental energy, that she hadn't thought it was important enough to warrant a special conversation. I stood in my mother's kitchen, staring at the refrigerator magnets, and felt that cold certainty settle into my chest that she was lying to me. Not about the basic facts, maybe, but about something fundamental underneath them. Olivia came into the kitchen after I hung up and asked point blank if I was going to let this happen. My sister had worked as a family therapist for 8 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read relationship dynamics. She said inviting an ex to an engagement party without telling your partner first was a massive red flag, the kind of boundary violation that suggested either complete emotional obliviousness or deliberate disrespect. I tried to defend Melissa, saying she was just trying to be mature about past relationships, but Olivia cut me off mid-sentence. She told me that mature people don't surprise their partners with decisions that affect their shared events, that healthy boundaries meant considering how your choices would impact the person you claimed to love most. The engagement party was scheduled for Saturday evening at the West Shore Country Club, an elegant venue that Melissa had selected because several of her firm's senior partners belonged there. I'd wanted something more casual, maybe a brewery with good food and a relaxed atmosphere, but Melissa had insisted that our engagement party needed to make the right impression on people who mattered for her career advancement. I'd given in because that's what I did with Melissa, compromised on things that seemed small individually, but added up to a pattern of her preferences taking priority. Now I was going to spend Saturday night at a country club I couldn't afford as a middle school teacher, celebrating my engagement while my fiancé's ex-boyfriend watched from table 7. Derek arrived exactly on time wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly take-home pay. I was standing near the entrance greeting early guests when he walked in, and I recognized him immediately from those deleted photos. He was better looking in person, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested regular gym sessions and expensive grooming products. He spotted Melissa across the room near the bar, and his entire face transformed, lighting up with an intensity that made my stomach drop. She saw him and smiled back with an expression I'd never seen her use with me, something unguarded and genuinely delighted that bypassed all her usual careful control. I watched them hug for approximately 7 seconds, long enough that several other guests noticed and exchanged glances. Derek said something that made Melissa laugh, that real, uninhibited laugh she rarely used around me. They stood together near the bar while the bartender made their drinks, deep in conversation that excluded everyone else in the room. I excused myself from talking to Melissa's aunt and walked over, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my teeth. Melissa introduced us with casual enthusiasm, like this was a completely normal situation, like I should be thrilled to meet the man she'd loved for 5 years before settling for me. Derek shook my hand with a grip that was just slightly too firm, maintaining eye contact for exactly the length of time needed to establish dominance without being overtly aggressive. He congratulated me on winning Melissa's heart, using that specific phrasing that suggested I'd won her away from him rather than that she'd chosen me independently. He mentioned how beautiful she looked tonight, how success clearly agreed with her, how proud he was to see everything she'd accomplished. The words were technically appropriate, but loaded with subtext that made it clear he still considered himself deeply invested in Melissa's life and happiness. I stood there holding my whiskey and felt like an intruder at my own engagement party. My best friend Garrett pulled me aside around 7:30, nodding toward where Melissa and Derek stood near the French doors leading to the terrace. Garrett had known me since high school and could read my moods with uncomfortable accuracy. He asked quietly if I knew that guy was Melissa's ex-boyfriend and whether I was okay with how they were interacting. I explained the situation as neutrally as possible, watching Garrett's expression shift from confusion to anger to something that looked like pity. He told me very directly that the way Derek was looking at Melissa wasn't how you look at someone you're over, and the way Melissa was responding suggested she wasn't exactly discouraging his attention. Around 8 o'clock, Melissa's boss stood up to give a toast about her brilliant career and bright future, making barely any mention of me or our relationship. He talked about Melissa's talent, her dedication, her innovative designs that had won the firm 3 major awards in 2 years. Then he pivoted to talking about how finding the right partner to support ambitious women was crucial, looking directly at me in a way that made it clear he didn't think I fit that description. Several of Melissa's colleagues nodded along, and I saw Derek smiling with this knowing expression, like he understood exactly what qualities Melissa needed that I apparently lacked. I gave my own speech around 8:30, standing up with a champagne glass and trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. I talked about meeting Melissa at a mutual friend's dinner party, being immediately drawn to her intelligence and drive. I mentioned how she challenged me to be better, pushed me outside my comfortable routines, made me think about the world differently. The words came out sounding weaker than I'd intended, less like a love declaration and more like I was justifying why someone like her would choose someone like me. I looked at Melissa during the speech and saw her checking her phone, barely paying attention to my words. Derek was watching her with an expression of concern that suggested he'd noticed her disengagement too. The terrace incident happened around 9:15 after most guests had finished dinner and moved to the bar or the dance floor. I went looking for Melissa and found the French doors to the terrace slightly open, voices drifting in from outside. I stepped through and saw Melissa and Derek standing close together near the stone balustrade, their body language intimate in a way that stopped me cold. She had her hand on his arm and he was leaning in, saying something too quiet for me to hear. I cleared my throat and they jumped apart like guilty teenagers caught making out. Melissa recovered quickly, smiling brightly and saying they'd just stepped out for fresh air and catching up about old friends. Derek excused himself to use the restroom, and I asked Melissa what was really happening between them. She looked at me with this mixture of irritation and something else, maybe guilt or frustration that I'd interrupted whatever moment they'd been having. She said I was being paranoid and insecure, that she was allowed to have conversations with old friends without me hovering over her shoulder. I pointed out that old friends don't usually look at each other the way I'd just witnessed, and she accused me of being jealous and controlling. The argument escalated quickly, both of us keeping our voices low but intense, aware that guests were just inside who might overhear. Melissa finally said something that cut through all the pretense and careful explanations. She told me that Derek represented a part of her life when she was figuring out who she wanted to become, and sometimes she missed the simplicity of being with someone who understood her ambitions from the beginning. I asked what that meant for us, and she hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. She said she loved me, but sometimes wondered if we were right for each other long term, if our different backgrounds and life goals would eventually create problems neither of us could overcome. I stood there on the terrace at my own engagement party and realized I was losing my fiancé to a man she claimed was just an old friend. I went back inside and found Garrett, pulling him into the men's room where we could talk privately. I told him everything that had just happened, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping myself together. Garrett listened, and then said something I needed to hear even though it hurt. He told me that Melissa had been pulling away for weeks, that he'd noticed her being distant and distracted whenever we were all together. He said he hadn't wanted to bring it up because it wasn't his place to interfere in my relationship, but watching tonight made it clear that something was seriously wrong. He suggested that maybe Derek's appearance wasn't random, that maybe Melissa had invited him specifically because she was reconsidering her choice. I spent the next hour moving through the party in a kind of fog, talking to guests, and accepting congratulations while watching Melissa and Derek orbit each other across the room. They weren't standing together constantly, but I noticed the pattern of glances, the way they managed to end up near each other at the bar or the dessert table. My mother cornered me near the gift table and asked quietly who Derek was and why he seemed so familiar with Melissa. I explained the situation and watched my mother's face go through several emotions before settling on disappointed resignation. She told me that I deserved someone who chose me fully and completely, not someone who kept her options open while wearing my engagement ring. Around 10:30, I walked outside to get genuine fresh air and found Derek sitting alone on a stone bench near the parking lot. He looked up when he heard my footsteps and gestured for me to sit down, which I did against my better judgment. We sat in silence for maybe a minute before Derek said something that changed the entire evening. He told me that Melissa had called him 6 weeks ago, not 2 months, and that she'd been the one to suggest meeting for more than just lunch. They'd seen each other 4 times, not once. He said he still loved her and had been devastated when she broke up with him, that seeing her with someone else had been killing him slowly over the past year. I asked Derek why he was telling me this, and he looked at me with something that might have been pity or respect. I couldn't quite tell. He said he'd assumed I knew about their meetings, that Melissa had been transparent with me the way she'd been transparent with him, when he realized tonight that I had no idea that she'd been hiding their renewed connection. He felt like he was participating in something dishonest. Derek told me he wanted Melissa back, but not like this, not by undermining another relationship through deception. He said I deserved to know the truth, even if it destroyed whatever chance he had with her, because nobody deserved to marry someone who was actively lying to them. I went back inside and found Melissa talking to her boss and several senior partners from the firm. I waited for a break in their conversation and then asked if we could talk privately, immediately, outside. Melissa looked annoyed at the interruption, but followed me back to the terrace where this nightmare had started. I confronted her with everything Derek had told me, watching her face cycle through denial, anger, and finally reluctant admission. She said Derek had exaggerated their meetings, that they'd seen each other a few times, but it was all innocent catching up. I asked why she'd lied about the timeline and frequency, and she said she knew I'd overreact and make it into something it wasn't. Melissa turned the argument around, accusing me of ruining our engagement party by being jealous and possessive. She said Derek was right that I was too insecure to handle her having successful, ambitious male friends. I pointed out that Derek wasn't just a friend, he was an ex-boyfriend she'd been secretly meeting while planning our wedding. She said the meetings weren't secret, just private, that she was entitled to maintain her own relationships without reporting every coffee date to me. The gaslighting was so blatant I almost laughed, this attempt to reframe her deliberate deception as my failure to trust her independence. I told Melissa the engagement was off, that I couldn't marry someone who lied to me repeatedly and then blamed me for being upset about it. She looked genuinely shocked, like this outcome hadn't occurred to her as a possibility. She said I was being rash and emotional, that we should discuss this tomorrow when I'd calmed down and thought rationally about throwing away our entire future. I pulled the engagement ring off my finger and held it out to her, my hand surprisingly steady considering how badly I was shaking inside. She refused to take it, saying I was making a huge mistake over nothing, that I'd regret this decision once I'd processed my feelings like an adult. Garrett appeared in the terrace doorway and asked if everything was okay, his presence a reminder that I had people who actually cared about my well-being. I told him we were leaving, that the party was over as far as I was concerned. Melissa grabbed my arm and told me I couldn't just walk out of our engagement party, that we had responsibilities to our guests and our families. I pulled my arm free gently but firmly and told her she could explain the situation however she wanted to, whoever asked. I was done performing for people who'd judged me inadequate from the moment I arrived. Garrett and I walked through the country club and out to the parking lot, while Melissa stood on the terrace calling after me. The next morning brought a series of texts from Melissa, alternating between apologetic and accusatory. She said she'd made mistakes, but I'd overreacted, that couples worked through problems instead of running away at the first sign of difficulty. She claimed Derek meant nothing to her emotionally, that their meetings had been about closure and processing their past relationship. I read through the messages and felt nothing except relief that I'd seen the truth before, legally binding myself to someone who couldn't be honest about basic facts. I blocked her number after sending one final text, saying all communication needed to go through lawyers regarding the dissolution of our engagement and division of shared assets. My mother took me out for breakfast at a diner near her house, letting me talk through everything that had happened without interrupting or offering advice. When I finally ran out of words, she told me about her first engagement to a man who'd seemed perfect on paper but wrong in every way that mattered. She'd called off that wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony and spent years wondering if she'd made a mistake. Then she met my father and understood what actual partnership looked like, the difference between compromising and constantly diminishing yourself to fit someone else's vision. She said, watching me with Melissa had reminded her of that first relationship, the way I'd been slowly erasing myself to become what she needed. Olivia showed up at my apartment that afternoon with takeout Thai food and a bottle of expensive bourbon. We sat on my living room floor eating pad Thai and talking about what came next. She told me that several mutual friends had already called asking what happened, that Melissa had posted a vague message on social media about needing time to process unexpected challenges. Olivia had responded to everyone that I was doing fine and would reach out when ready, establishing a boundary that protected me from having to explain myself repeatedly. She asked if I'd heard from Derek, and I showed her the text he'd sent around noon, apologizing for his role in the disaster and saying he hoped I'd find someone worthy of my decency. The legal dissolution process started Monday morning when I met with an attorney named Kathleen Moss, who specialized in contract disputes and family law. She asked detailed questions about our shared finances, property, and the deposits we'd paid for wedding venues and services. I explained that most deposits were in Melissa's name since she'd insisted on handling those arrangements, that we had a joint checking account with about $4,000, and that she'd been living in my apartment for 6 months but wasn't on the lease. Kathleen took notes and explained that engagement dissolution was relatively straightforward compared to divorce, especially since we had minimal shared assets and no children to consider. Melissa's attorney contacted Kathleen within 3 days, requesting a meeting to discuss equitable division of engagement-related expenses. Apparently, Melissa wanted me to reimburse her for half of what she'd spent on the engagement party, including my portion of the country club fee, catering, and photography. The claim totaled approximately $9,000, money I definitely didn't have as a teacher with student loan debt. Kathleen drafted a response pointing out that Melissa had insisted on the expensive venue against my preference for something more modest, that she'd invited her ex-boyfriend without my knowledge or consent, and that she'd been conducting a secret emotional affair during our engagement. The letter suggested that if Melissa wanted to pursue financial claims, we could present the full context to a judge and see how that played out. Derek called me a week after the engagement party, asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something made me curious about what he wanted to say. We met at a neutral cafe downtown, sitting across from each other like opposing generals negotiating a truce. Derek apologized for complicating my life, said he hadn't fully understood the situation when Melissa first reached out to him. He explained that she'd painted our relationship as already failing, claimed we were mostly together out of inertia rather than genuine love. When he saw us together at the party, he'd realized Melissa had been lying to him about the state of our relationship, just like she'd been lying to me about their meetings. Derek told me that after I left the party, he'd confronted Melissa about her deception and dishonesty. She'd broken down and admitted that she'd been confused about her feelings, unsure if she'd ended things with him for the right reasons. She'd gotten engaged to me, thinking it would help her move forward, but seeing Derek again had brought back all the intensity she'd been trying to escape. Derek said he'd told her he couldn't be with someone who treated people as disposable or manipulated situations to serve her own uncertainty. He'd left the party shortly after, declining Melissa's tearful request to stay and talk more. He wanted me to know that Melissa had created this disaster, not him, and that he respected how I'd handled myself throughout the nightmare. I went back to work the following Monday, teaching 7th grade English to kids who had no idea their teacher's life had just exploded. The normalcy helped, giving me structure and purpose beyond processing the dissolution of my engagement. My students were reading The Great Gatsby, and we discussed themes of illusion versus reality, how people construct fantasies about others that have nothing to do with who those people actually are. The conversations felt uncomfortably relevant to my own situation. This recognition that I'd built an idea of Melissa that ignored evidence she'd been showing me for months about her priorities and values. Melissa showed up at my apartment 3 weeks after the engagement party, using the key I'd forgotten to ask her to return. I came home from grocery shopping and found her sitting on my couch, crying. She looked genuinely devastated, her polished appearance completely gone in favor of messy hair and swollen eyes. She said she'd made terrible mistakes, let her ambition and insecurity drive decisions that hurt someone who genuinely loved her. She claimed she'd been overwhelmed by pressure from her firm to present a certain image, to have a partner who fit their expectations of success. Dating me had been an act of rebellion against those shallow values, but she'd ultimately caved to pressure when Derek offered her a way back to the life she'd left. I listened to Melissa's confession and apology, watching her fall apart in my living room. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, to fall back into the pattern of making her feel better about choices that hurt me. But a stronger part recognized this moment as crucial, the difference between repeating old patterns and actually moving forward into something healthier. I told Melissa that I believed she was genuinely sorry and that I forgave her for the lies and manipulation. Then I told her that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, that I couldn't be with someone who saw relationships as negotiable based on career pressures or comparison to past partners. Melissa left my apartment key on the coffee table and walked out, pausing at the door to say she hoped I'd find someone who deserved my kindness. The comment felt genuine rather than manipulative, maybe the first completely honest thing she'd said to me in months. I closed the door behind her and sat down on the couch she'd just vacated, feeling that strange combination of grief and relief that comes from ending something that was slowly suffocating you. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia asking if I was okay, and I realized my sister had probably been parked outside watching Melissa leave, ready to intervene if needed. I texted back that I was fine, actually fine for the first time since the engagement party. The months that followed brought gradual healing and unexpected clarity about what I actually wanted from life and partnership. I started therapy with a psychologist named Dr. Raymond Fletcher, who specialized in relationship patterns and helping people understand why they chose incompatible partners. The sessions revealed how I'd been attracted to Melissa's ambition because it felt like validation, proof that someone impressive had chosen ordinary me. But that foundation was poisonous, building a relationship on my perceived inadequacy rather than mutual respect and compatible values. Dr. Fletcher helped me recognize my own worth beyond other people's assessment, to understand that teaching middle school was valuable work, regardless of how Melissa's colleagues viewed it. I ran into Melissa's boss at a fundraiser 6 months later, a charity event where local professionals gathered to support arts education in public schools. He recognized me and approached with what looked like genuine remorse, apologizing for how he'd treated me at the engagement party. He said he'd been projecting his own values onto Melissa's life, assuming she needed a partner who matched her career success rather than someone who supported her as a person. He mentioned that Melissa had left the firm 3 months earlier, burned out and disillusioned with the competitive culture that had consumed her identity. The news surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have. Melissa had always been chasing something external, rather than building from internal values. Olivia hosted a small dinner party at her house 9 months after the engagement party, inviting me and several of her friends, including a woman named Jennifer, who taught art at a nearby high school. We spent the evening talking about our students, sharing funny stories about classroom disasters and unexpected moments of connection. Jennifer had an easy warmth that felt completely different from Melissa's calculated charm, a genuine interest in other people that came from security rather than strategy. We exchanged numbers at the end of the evening with no pressure or expectation, just two people who'd enjoyed talking to each other and might want to do it again. The final text from Melissa arrived almost a year after the engagement party, sent late at night from a number I didn't recognize. She said she'd been thinking about how badly she'd handled everything, how her fear of not being enough had driven her to sabotage something real. She mentioned that Derek had been right to walk away from her, that she'd realized too late she'd been using both of us to avoid dealing with her own insecurities. She hoped I'd found happiness and peace, said she was working on becoming someone capable of healthy relationships. I read the message twice before deciding not to respond. I deleted the text and went back to grading papers, content with the quiet life I'd built from the wreckage of what had felt like my future. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.